Hezbollah's command structure has been taken down very significantly. Uh, it doesn't mean that Hezbollah are bereft of resources. They still have some left. But that strategic direction of Hezbollah has gone. Hamas, as a military movement, not as an idea or not as an ideology, is in the process of being fundamentally destroyed. And of course, Syria, which was crucial to Iran, the backer, crucial to Hezbollah in terms of supplying Hezbollah in Lebanon, crucial to Hamas as well to an extent. This is all gone. It's in the process of being destroyed.
Now, tonight, our Newsmaker interview, and we have one of these every Thursday evening, of course, at this time, is with Sir Richard Dearlove. He was the head of MI6, the Secret Intelligence Service, between 1999 and 2004, in a role known as C. He ran MI6 during the Iraq War and spent more than 40 years at the heart of British intelligence. We're really pleased to have you join us, Sir Richard Dearlove. Thank you.
Good evening, Kate. It's very nice to be with you.
I must start by saying, or by asking you actually, if you find that the world is at a fascinating juncture when it comes to so many different global security and insecurity issues, some of which cross-sex, intersects, whether you find that a fascinating thing to view on from afar.
Totally obsessive, I guess, is my answer. I mean, I'm now very much focused on geopolitics, and I don't think in the whole of my career, which started way back, I've ever seen such a mixture of problems and crises as we are now facing. So one can be completely preoccupied with observing and trying to analyze these events. I mean, basically, Pax Americana, which was the primary framework of the international security system after World War II, has disappeared or is disappearing. It hasn't disappeared completely. But the question now is, how do we view the future of the international security system? How is it going to be composed? What are the elements that will emerge from the current series of crises that we're in?
Should we talk about that a little then? Maybe we should start off by looking at the main challenges, the main threats to the international security system as you perceive it.
Well, I think the largest long-term threat is unquestionably China. And what I mean by that is China emerging from being a regional power to being a superpower, contesting the global space with the United States. So the sort of existential question in the medium to long term is, how do we organize our relationship with China? And the complexity is that it isn't like the Cold War. There isn't a sort of separation between East and West, because the West's economies are intertwined with China. So how do we manage that relationship, particularly when, if you look at the statements of the Chinese leadership, the Communist Party leadership, for example, in the papers relating to the 20th Party Congress, they say quite clearly that China's ambition is global domination by, I think the date is 2150 or around that period. So how do we organize dealing with China? And it's clear that, if you look at the foreign policy or the preoccupations of commentators in the United States and in Europe, there is a certain understanding that although our day-to-day preoccupation at the moment may not be entirely with China, that is the big issue and the big question. But, if we step back to the immediate affairs that we're faced with today, we have a major contained, and I think that's extraordinary that it is contained, war in Central Europe. And of course, we have a massive ongoing crisis in the Middle East, with the tectonic plates apparently beginning to shift and move in terms of the various interest groups and conflicts that have afflicted the Middle East now for a considerable period of time.
You say that you're surprised that the war is contained in Central Europe. How fragile is that? Do we credit an organisation like NATO for keeping it contained? You know, because many of those countries bordering, many of those countries close to Ukraine are NATO members. Does an organisation like NATO has that ensured that the war in Central Europe is contained?
To an extent, yes, because the NATO treaty is quite clear that, you know, one nation attacked or assaulted, the alliance comes to its assistance. So it's quite clear that, you know, if any member state is threatened, that is a prelude to a more generalized conflict. But on the other hand, if you look at the situation in Ukraine, I think what is surprising, and I mean, it's surprising in the context of my own experience, my own career, is that the Russian general staff, I think, and I'm not talking about Putin, I'm talking about the command of the Russian military, have been very careful not to escalate the conflict outside the borders of Ukraine. And I think that one has to conclude from that having invaded Ukraine, well, it goes back to 2014, but the invasion of apart from Crimea, that invasion that's been such a significant event for European security as a whole has not precipitated a general conflict, because they clearly expected, or the Russian army expected, to walk down the road to Kyiv, to dominate and take the country in a short period of time. But we're now into a 1,000-day war. Well,
and then potentially pick up another country after that.
If you can't win that conflict, are you really going to commit your resources to a general war with Europe? I think it's clearly highly unlikely. I mean, the Russian general staff are rational military commanders, and they have clearly been very careful to avoid the conflict escaping the borders of Ukraine. But I mean, that doesn't detract from the fact that we have a really bloody and expensive and deadly conflict that afflicts this particular country. I mean, it's unprecedented.
You also talked about the crisis in the Middle East and the tectonic plate shifting. Let's just talk about the fall of Bashar al-Assad first of all, and then we can talk about what else is happening there, and there is plenty happening in that region. Were you surprised by the overthrowing of Bashar al-Assad's regime?
I was surprised how speedily it happened. But clearly, when you have a regime like Assad's, which is not necessarily weak, but extremely brittle, when the politics surrounding Syria, which have kept him in power, change fundamentally, then, as we've seen, he's incredibly, well, not just vulnerable, he's going to be deposed, and deposed very quickly. I think we were all shocked by the speed with which this happened. But I mean, the reason it clearly happened is because his primary protectors, Hezbollah, on the one hand, and the Russians on the other, given the conflicts that they're preoccupied with at the moment, were not there to support him. So as this HTS movement in Idlib, up in the corner of of Syria, and backed by the Turks, I mean, certainly this is in my book, this is a significant Turkish initiative. They couldn't possibly have done what they've done without Turkish encouragement, Turkish support, Turkish backing. And, they bowled down the road to Damascus. There was no opposition. I mean, there's an interesting parallel. Think about Prigozhin advancing on Moscow. Putin clearly panicked when Prigozhin advanced on Moscow, but for some reason, for reasons that we don't necessarily understand, he stopped. And, he didn't succeed. But there is a partial parallel between those two events, which I haven't heard anybody draw it yet.
No, it's true. Prigozhin met his end on a flight, of course. In terms of the wider situation in the Middle East, so you talked about Hezbollah and the fact that they were no longer resourced to be able to protect the Assad regime. We know that, there are question marks over Russia in that country as well. They've got a really important naval base there. The role of Israel in bombing parts of Syria at the moment. Israel, I think, has a war, they say, on, is it 9 fronts now? I mean, Israel are intent on being everywhere. And actually, they are the common thread, aren't they, Israel? If we look at Syria, what's happening now, Gaza, Lebanon, and beyond, it is Israel, isn't it, who are they taking advantage of instability within the region? Is there an ulterior motive here by their prime minister? What do you make of it?
Well, of course, they are taking advantage of the instability. And I think that the fundamental issue is that Israel has called Iran's bluff, and the Iranian strategy of conducting warfare in the Middle East through proxies, Houthis, Hezbollah, and Hamas, because of October the 7th, has been fundamentally challenged in a way that hadn't happened hitherto. And I mean, let's face it, Iran was creating mayhem through the Quds Force, through the IRGC, which was supporting these terrorist movements, which were constantly probing Israel's security and attacking Israel. So you have Hamas first, and the invasion of the 7th of October. I mean, my personal view is that the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, probably had a significant hand. That's disputed. They say that Hamas made this invasion, this initiative, this attack, to an extent off its own bat. But I mean, this clearly has, destabilized the region quite fundamentally. And I think what the Israelis have found is that these movements are not as sustained and powerful as people thought. I mean, if you go back to 2006, there was a significant, conflict between Israel and Hezbollah. And at that point in time, Israel, that wasn't really geared up to fighting Hezbollah, the IDF in Lebanon, came off rather badly. It's clear to me that since that event, Israel has learned a lot of lessons and changed its attitude and changed its policies. And I mean, it's really a cliche to say that the big changes globally are triggered either by warfare or by revolution. You can go back to 1789 and go through all the stages of European history and explain or show how that has happened. And I mean, it's clear that this conflict now, conducted by Israel with great strategic insight, has caused massive breakdown in the sort of conventions, and I call them conventional, although they're regressive conventions, which has defined the way the Middle East acted for the last 10 to 15 years. And I mean, the most significant event is the last one, which is this extraordinary collapse of Syria. And of course, when Syria collapses, the Israelis are not going to sit there and do nothing. They've taken out a lot of the strategic capability that Assad had built up, and was to be there taken over by a new government, God knows what complexion it would have.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. And their justification is protecting the Golan Heights, protecting border territory, and what they are concerned about is the rise of extreme Islamists, so, ISIS, etc. Has the axis of resistance, as we're talking about Iran, has that been shattered?
yeah, I think it's pretty much over yes. I mean, Hezbollah's command structure has been taken down very significantly. It doesn't mean that Hezbollah are bereft of resources. They still have some left. But that strategic direction of Hezbollah has gone. Hamas, as a military movement, not as an idea or not as an ideology, is in the process of being fundamentally destroyed. And of course, Syria, which was crucial to Iran, the backer, crucial to Hezbollah in terms of supplying Hezbollah in Lebanon, crucial to Hamas as well to an extent. This is all gone. It's in the process of being destroyed. The question is now, what's the aftermath? What's going to happen next?
Yeah, is a question to ask. Look, I mentioned at the top there that you were head of MI6 during the Iraq War, during the invasion of the country, and you were personally criticised in the Chilcot report for MI6's intelligence about weapons of mass destruction existing in the country, which turned out to be poor intelligence in retrospect. What do you make of those criticisms? Do you feel that they're fair?
I think that the issue still is poorly understood and poorly investigated. And did the Chilcot report actually go to Iraq to investigate these issues? No, it didn't. It was a governmental report conducted in the UK around the issues of the policy decisions that the Blair government took at that time. The intelligence was part of the argument. But let's face it, when you go to war or when you make a policy decision, there are many other elements that come into play. Look, this is a complex issue, and I'm not going to go into detail now because we'd be on air for a couple of hours.
But you essentially stand by your intelligence.
I don't stand by the intelligence. Some of it was wrong, but more of it was right than people understand. And I think that, interestingly, the breakdown of the government in Syria perhaps provides more opportunities, if anyone cares to investigate them, in relation to issues like chemical weapons, because it's clear in my view that a lot of stuff went over the border into Syria. Surprise, surprise, Syria then used it. But, these are issues not for really discussion in this interview, because it takes down a number of other issues, which it'll take a long time for me.
And just look, reflecting on MI6 and their role, what does a destabilised Middle East mean for us, mean for the UK and the West, and how important a part intelligence has to play?
Well, it has a massively important part to play in trying to understand and have precise insight into what's happening and how that affects European security more broadly, global security, and the security of the United Kingdom. One aspect, of course, is the issue of the radicalization of Islam and the extent to which, let's say, events in Syria now will regenerate a threat from organizations like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. There is also the problem of the displacement of populations in the Middle East. And of course, this fuels the immigration crisis. There are other issues that relate to weapons development, whether Iran is en route to become a nuclear power, and I'm sure some of our listeners are familiar with issues like that. I mean, there are so many aspects to this which are partly, policy initiatives that can be dealt with by conventional diplomats, but there are a number of other issues which will be, let's say, intelligence requirements placed upon my former service, which the policymakers will want answered in order to try to create good policy which takes account of these very difficult issues. If you're in a state of ignorance, it's very difficult to develop good policy. But the challenges at the moment in the Middle East are huge. And the other thing I should say, which I think is really important, is the ability of the United Kingdom, through its diplomats, through its intelligence capability, to talk to the Middle Eastern powers with whom we have close relations, so that we gain the benefits of their insights into these issues. And I mean, the one thing that we haven't really talked about in relation to the Middle East, you've talked about Hamas, or I've talked about Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthis, Iran, but I mean, there is the more fundamental issue of the struggle between Sunni and Shia Islam.
Yes, within Syria. I am going to have to call time on this fascinating conversation. I'm so sorry to leave it there, but I've really enjoyed talking to you, and I know our listeners would have enjoyed hearing from you as well. Thank you so much for being with us, Sir Richard Dearlove. Thank you.